Here's something interesting that came out. Trudeau responds to criticism of carbon tax rollout, which was called a dumpster fire by those closest to the rollout of the carbon tax. And this is actually one of the rarities we see Trudeau do a podcast or interview style format. I wish actually he did more so that, you know, I feel like a lot of times Trudeau comes across as too scripted in a time where Canadians are really hurting, whether it's financially, during COVID-19, health wise, et cetera, especially when it comes to mental health. I don't know. I just feel like we need a prime minister that's a little bit more real. And, doing kind of free flowing conversations gets to that. But I understand as a politician, you kind of need to stay on the script. But, anyways, I want to share with you a little bit of this interview so we can watch it together.
You think you've made that case?
I think we're continuing to make that case. It's understandable that at a time of anxiety, of pressure on costs, of affordability concerns, that some politicians are trying to, drum up support for themselves by scaring people and by giving misinformation. It's unfortunate, but we're going to continue telling the truth.
So just to be clear, you don't think you've lost the narrative on this? We had a conversation this week with somebody who's a defender of the carbon tax. He explained it. He talked about it as a dumpster fire in terms of how it's rolled out. You don't think you've lost the narrative on this?
I think what we've actually done in the policy, it is helping Canadians. Now, the fact that conservative premiers or the conservative leader of the opposition wants to take away those supports for Canadians, that's something that people need to hear. And that's not something that they're talking about. So we're continuing to talk about the fact that they have no plan to fight climate change and no plan to keep supporting people with affordability.
Of course, it's not just conservative premiers, though. It's Wab Kinew in Manitoba. It's a fellow Liberal in Andrew Furey in Newfoundland and Labrador. What would it take for them?
I just want to pause there. Good on the CBC for holding the Prime Minister to account. They could have easily glossed over the fact that Wab Kinew, NDP Premier of Manitoba, is against the carbon tax, as well as Liberal Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. So interesting that the CBC, a lot of people criticize the CBC, myself included, that it seems a bit too close to the Liberal Party of Canada. But in this case, Matt Galloway does highlight that it's not just Conservatives criticizing Trudeau on the carbon tax, it's members of other parties as well.
Them to convince you that this is not the right policy?
Well, they have the opportunity to put forward a pricing frame that makes sure that pollution isn't free at the same level for the rest of the country, but in a way that works for their province if they don't want to have the federal backstop. Indeed, a number of provinces started with that. BC and Quebec still have it. Ontario actually only has the carbon tax because Doug Ford got rid of the cap and trade system. So as he rails against the price on pollution and the rebate we're giving to Ontario, he's actually responsible directly for it because he scrapped the Made in Ontario pricing plan they had.
So Andrew Furey has said that he wants a meeting with you to talk about this. He wants the premiers to come together with you. Will you have that meeting?
I had a meeting in 2016.
Will
with
you
all
have the
premiers when we built
meeting
this.
now with?
I will continue to talk with premiers, but I will continue to be pressing Andrew and all others on the actual facts that we have a plan to fight climate change that puts more money back in the pockets of Canadians that need it.
One of the reasons why there's great anxiety over this is because, as you've said, there are a lot of people who feel like the system is stacked against them. Young people in particular, they do everything they can. They get a good job. They're working hard. They can't square that circle. You've had 9 years in power. To what extent is your government responsible for the fact that that system is stacked against them?
We got elected in 2015 focused on supporting the middle class, and we brought in a number of measures that made a huge difference. We cut child poverty in half in this country with the Canada Child Benefit. But particularly since the pandemic, we've seen things get so much more difficult for so many people, particularly the young people who've been my motivation since I got into politics 15 years ago. So investing in them, supporting them as renters, making sure there's a pathway for them to buy a home, making sure that they're confident that.
Okay, these are just talking points now. That's the thing about Trudeau. He comes across as just totally aloof with what Canadians are going through. But I just want to say that there's a couple things. First of all, again, shout out to the CBC for actually questioning Trudeau on some of the logic behind the carbon tax. I wish they did a little bit more digging and probing onto that, because Trudeau said some interesting things. One, he said, we're putting this price on pollution. Now, that assumes a couple things when you say things like that. It assumes that people are going to make better choices because this tax is on them. They started with a 3 cents per liter tax. Will Canadians actually not choose to fill up their tank of gas because of that? Probably not, because it's inelastic. You need your car to get around, especially in cities where transit isn't always an option, or it's not, it's not the full option. It can't get you fully from point A to point B. And then suburban and rural communities, there's just no option other than filling up your tank of gas. So people won't necessarily make better choices because of the carbon tax, I don't think, because it's not, this idea that there's a lot of things we do in our lives, in our economic activity, that's out of necessity. It's not out of a choice to harm the environment. You know, electric vehicles are still in its early days, in my opinion. I don't think that most Canadians would choose an electric vehicle right now because it's not a one-for-one comparison to a gas-powered vehicle. If you drive a pickup truck and you live outside an urban center, or, you just drive around for your business, and personal, etc., you're putting 50, 60 kilometers a day. You throw a load on that, range gets affected on electric pickup trucks by load, by weather and climate conditions. All those things affect your range. And I don't know. I just don't think we're there just yet for wide-scale adoption in EVs on top of the price. So people are choosing gas and even hybrid vehicles not for the environment, but for their bank account. And right now, that's the priority. And I think that's the piece that Trudeau seems to be missing. This idea that pricing pollution will somehow lead to people making better choices for the environment at a time when interest rates are really high, inflation's really high. There aren't any real signs those are going to come down dramatically in the near future. So until that happens, and even when that does happen, I think people will still be very reticent about spending money in excess, because they've seen where that can go and what happens as a result, right? Over the past 2.5 years, we've had 7 interest rate hikes in Canada, and a lot of Canadians are struggling. They're walking away from properties they can no longer afford. I mean, it is really bad for so many Canadians. So that's the piece he's missing. It's Canadians aren't going to make better choices. I think the other thing that Trudeau seems to be missing is the rebate piece, right? So like the idea that you tax me up front, but then when I file my income tax, or sorry, not when I file my income tax, but 4 times in the year, I'm going to get a carbon tax rebate. Now, on paper, that sounds great, but people don't think that way, right? There's a lot of research about how effective tax rebates actually are. The idea that you get taxed up front, but later on you get compensated for that, it doesn't always work, because people are very much interested psychologically in instant gratification and instant rewards. So the idea that you're going to somehow get people on board with a rebate is a bit challenging. And the final point I'll say about all of this, I've said it before, even if we eliminate the carbon tax, it doesn't affect your bottom line. It is very much a tax that's on the margins. It's not going to make a difference to your bottom line at all. The biggest difference is actually with your income tax. And I don't think that's going to change in any time soon. I hope it does. But that's really, I wish more politicians were talking about your income tax rates, because those should really come down to be more in line with the OECD average. Canada is much higher taxed on income than many other countries around the world, and more politicians should be talking about that. But forget politicians, more of us should be talking about that. More Canadians should be talking about the high income tax we pay in Canada, based on our population and based on so many other factors. But those are my initial assessments. I don't think Trudeau seems to be fully understanding that Canadians don't really care too much about a price on pollution because they're making choices out of necessity. I don't think he fully understands that a rebate doesn't psychologically work with most Canadians. Delayed gratification isn't really something that Canadians want. And finally, I think that more Canadians in general should be talking about the biggest tax we all pay, which is income tax. But let me know what you think in the comments section below.